He could have ended Walter White's empire with one word, but in the world of the Salamancas, silence speaks louder than life itself. There's something almost poetic about the Salamanca twins.
Old guy in a wheelchair.
Two men who treat silence not as a lack of speech, but as a declaration of identity. When one of them drags himself across the hospital floor, legless and dying, just to glare at Walter White through a window, the scene feels like it should culminate in a whispered confession, a gasp of the truth. Instead, nothing. No name, no accusation, just a final act of stubborn, undying pride. The reason is brutally simple. Salamancas don't talk. Not to cops, not to the DEA, and certainly not to the men who represent order in a world built on chaos. In their universe, speaking to law enforcement isn't cooperation. It's spiritual decay. It's why Hector Salamanca would rather detonate himself in a nursing home than give the DEA an ounce of help.
No van a matar a Walt.
In that world, silence isn't cowardice. It's code. It's the unspoken rule of the underworld. The Latin cousin of omerta, the Italian mafia's ancient vow of silence. Snitching is worse than death because it kills something more permanent than the body, reputation. Once branded a rat, you're not a man anymore. You're carrion. Every ally becomes an executioner. So when the cousin saw Walter White, the man he was sent to kill, through that hospital window, there was no choice to be made. His mission had already failed. His brother was dead. His legs were gone. The only thing left to protect was dignity. He could have pointed, shouted, whispered, "Heisenberg," and earned himself a police escort to a slow, irrelevant death. But then he'd die as the man who helped the DEA, a Salamanca snitch, a cosmic joke.
This is what comes of blood for blood, Hector.
To the cartel, betrayal is contagious. Talk once, and you could talk again. About anyone, about everyone. That kind of man doesn't live long enough to regret it. Silence, however, grants something closer to immortality. It preserves the myth. It's why the Salamancas endure as legends in the criminal lore of Breaking Bad. Men who'd rather crawl through glass and die nameless than speak a truth that serves the enemy. It's not logic, it's loyalty. Not morality, it's madness, refined into honor. And as for the DEA, they were never owed an explanation.
We may have a problem. I got eyes on the DEA. They just had a visitor. Hector Salamanca.
The only thing the Salamancas ever gave them was silence. And eventually, an explosion. Walter White could have lived rich, respected, and cancer-free. But his pride wouldn't let him. There's no real mystery behind Walter White's downfall. It wasn't greed that broke him. Greed would have been far too ordinary. Too human. Greed takes what it's offered.
Have a seat, Heisenberg.
Pride, however, spits on the offer, builds a meth lab in the desert, and calls it self-respect. From the beginning, Walt's life is a cautionary sermon about what happens when a man decides that humiliation is worse than death. His empire wasn't built on ambition or even desperation. It was constructed brick by brick from bruised ego.
Are you asking me to come work for you at Gray Matter?
He could have rejoined Gray Matter, enjoyed the luxury of a billionaire's salary, world-class medical care, and a life of comfort. But that would have required swallowing his pride, and Walt would sooner choke on it. Money, for him, was never wealth. It was a scoreboard. Each dollar wasn't a means of survival, but a symbol of victory over everyone who once dared to pity him.
Elliot and I offered to pay for your treatment.
When Elliot and Gretchen offered to pay for his cancer treatment, he refused, not because he didn't need it, but because pity was unbearable.
Heisenberg says, relax.
Accepting help would have meant acknowledging he was powerless. And for Walter White, power was oxygen. Even his greed was just pride in disguise.
I mean, he knows you're Heisenberg.
He didn't crave money. He craved recognition. Heisenberg wasn't a criminal identity. It was a monument. Every reckless act was another nameplate on his self-made pedestal. He could have retired several times, richer than he ever dreamed. But he stayed in the game because walking away meant admitting that he'd done enough. And enough never felt like triumph. Pride was also the silent puppeteer behind every fatal decision. The murder of Mike wasn't business. It was ego wounded by a few harsh words. The infamous Walt Whitman book left in his bathroom was an oversight. It was vanity so bloated it couldn't imagine being caught.
So, you think this Gale person...
And when Hank finally began to suspect Gale was Heisenberg, Walt couldn't help himself. He had to correct him. The truth was a ticking bomb, and he wanted everyone to hear it before it exploded. Even his justification, doing it for his family, crumbled under his own confession.
I did it for me.
I did it for me, he admits. I liked it. I was good at it. That's not greed. That's pride finally taking a bow. Walter White's tragedy isn't that he wanted too much. It's that he couldn't bear to be less. Pride was both the engine and the executioner, driving him to greatness and ensuring that greatness destroyed him. Every sin he committed, envy, deceit, murder, was merely a shadow cast by one towering flaw. In the end, it wasn't meth or money that built the empire. It was pride, pure and uncut. Walter White isn't an anti-hero. He's a villain fans accidentally turned into a hero. It's remarkable how a show built on moral decay can still inspire such fierce apologism. Somewhere between the first cook and the final ricin-laced goodbye, Walter White stopped being a character and became a martyr, at least to the fans still scrambling to excuse his every sin.
Who's okay with using children?
The reasoning is predictable. If Jesse hadn't messed up, if Hank hadn't pushed so hard, if Gus had just trusted him, the mental gymnastics required to turn Walter White, kingpin of chaos, into a misunderstood genius would make even Saul Goodman proud. Let's start with the simplest truth.
I am awake.
Every disaster in Breaking Bad originates with Walter's pride. He had a choice.
He'd offered to.
Gretchen and Elliot offered him financial salvation, a lifeline that would have left him alive, employed, and possibly even dignified. But dignity doesn't stroke the ego. So instead, Walter chose the meth lab over medical bills, a crown of blue crystals over common sense. Everything that followed, the betrayals, the bodies, the misery, was his own hand pulling the trigger. Of course, the standard rebuttal arrived swiftly, but Jesse messed up so many times. Indeed, Jesse Pinkman was a walking calamity. He botched deals, got high at the worst possible moments, and made emotional decisions that cost lives. Yet it's disingenuous to pretend that Walt was a victim of Jesse's incompetence.
You and I will not make garbage.
Walt chose Jesse. He brought him back time and time again, not out of loyalty, but control. Jesse's mistakes gave Walt purpose, a perpetual crisis that let him play the savior. And then there's the argument that Gus Fring would have killed Walt anyway. Maybe so, but Gus didn't walk into a high school chemistry class with a job offer. Walt came knocking on his door. He wasn't forced into the drug trade. He hunted it down like a challenge. Every supposed necessary kill, Jane, Crazy 8, Mike, the prison men, was framed as survival. Yet each death only tightened the noose of Walt's making. He didn't just break bad. He built the blueprint for his own destruction and sold it wholesale. The Walt isn't evil defense deserves its own obituary. Poisoning a child, watching a young woman choke to death, and emotionally brutalizing a partner isn't some dark but misunderstood anti-hero arc. It's villainy in slow motion. Yes, Walt cried after Jane died. So do crocodiles when they snap their jaws shut.
I'm sorry about Jane.
His remorse, when it surfaced, was less morality than performance. A brief flicker of humanity quickly drowned by self-justification. Yet his defenders cling to moments of selective decency. He saved Jesse's life. He tried to protect his family, as if a lifetime of violence is absolved by a few conveniently timed acts of restraint. Walt didn't save Jesse out of compassion. He saved him out of guilt, control, and the fear of losing his reflection. Jesse wasn't his partner. He was his project. His proof that Walter White could play God and still call it love.
But I prefer to see it as the study of change.
The tragedy of Breaking Bad isn't that Walt turned evil. It's that he always was. The cancer didn't change him. It merely stripped away the polite mask. What's left is a man who wanted to feel powerful and found his justification in chemistry. His empire wasn't built for his family. It was built for his ego, and by the time he admitted it, the moral wreckage was already complete. Fans can debate the degrees of guilt among the supporting cast all they want. Hank's obsession, Skyler's complicity, Jesse's relapse, but none of it erases the core truth.
Hank, it's Walt. Hey.
Everyone else fell because Walt pushed first. So no, Walter White doesn't deserve sympathy, reinterpretation, or moral leniency. He deserves what every self-made monster earns.
We're just getting started.
Full credit for the empire of ruin he so meticulously built, brick by brick, cook by cook. Walter White's biggest mistake wasn't cooking meth. It was staying silent. There's a universe where Walter White, instead of waiting for a bathroom epiphany to destroy his brother-in-law's sanity, simply sits Hank Schrader down one day and confesses, "I'm Heisenberg."
Yes, Walt.
Yeah.
We need to be word perfect.
A bold thought experiment, mainly because imagining Hank's response requires picturing the impossible, Walter White voluntarily taking responsibility for anything before being cornered. Still, if such a confession had ever happened early enough, the reaction depends entirely on when it took place.
Okay. Hank, need another beer?
Season 1 Hank, the beer-drinking, barbecue-cracking, slightly oblivious DEA agent, would never have believed it. Walt could have said, "I was abducted by Tuco Salamanca," and Hank would have laughed it off as another midlife melodrama from his nerdy, underpaid brother-in-law. Even a duffel bag full of cash wouldn't have raised more than an eyebrow. Hank would have just chalked it up to Walt being eccentric, or hiding some unmanly secret, like poetry royalties. But let's assume persistence. Suppose Walt manages to convince him. The most likely outcome? Arrest, of course, but not with the Season 5 fury we saw later.
Walt, you got a brain the size of Wisconsin.
Early on, Hank might have softened the blow. He'd still slap on the cuffs, but maybe with a sigh instead of a scream.
What? Maybe Walt wants to die like a man, all right?
A dying man cooking meth to leave money behind for his family. Hank would have understood the desperation, even respected the intent before the betrayal stung. He couldn't change the law, but he could nudge the paperwork. Maybe a cooperative witness deal. Maybe a nicer prison. He'd certainly use his weight to make the fall less brutal. As the timeline progresses, though, sympathy decays faster than methylamine. The more Heisenberg's name circulates through the DEA, the less room there is for compassion.
That call I got, tell me Marie was in the hospital. That was in Pinkman.
By the time Walt manipulates Hank with fake phone calls, sabotages investigations, and kills witnesses by the dozen, any personal bond would have been ash in the wind. At that point, Hank's reaction wouldn't be, "Walt, you poor fool," but rather, "You bombed a nursing home. You're going under the jail."
Not going to Hank and Marie's. I'm not going in.
Of course, in the rare event Hank did believe in early confession, his first instinct would have been to protect Skylar and the kids. The DEA agent in him would take over, isolate the family, pressure Walt into becoming an informant, and dismantle the operation from within.
Witness protection kind of.
Walt would probably end up in witness protection. A neat segue into a sitcom crossover no one asked for. ASAC Schrader, Tuesdays on CBS. Picture Hank, Marie, and a newly single Skylar living under one roof.
They're minerals.
Cue the laugh track. They're minerals, Marie! In the end, it's the difference between being caught and coming clean that defines Walt's tragedy. A confession might have earned him a sliver of dignity, perhaps even pity. Instead, he let pride calcify into deceit, until the only truth left was the one Hank found on the bathroom floor. Walt's hypothetical honesty would have been his salvation. Instead, he chose silence and built an empire of lies on top of it. Walter White wasn't addicted to money or power. He was addicted to credit.
Believe it or not, I found this on my car.
Walter White's genius was never in question. His judgment, however, was catastrophically flawed. For a man who could construct an empire out of chemistry, he was remarkably inept at recognizing a trap when it was baited with his own arrogance. When Jesse sent that fake photo of the buried cash, Walt's paranoia did the rest.
I took the liberty of removing the battery.
Instead of stepping back, breathing, and, heaven forbid, removing the battery from his phone, he charged head first into his downfall.
It's me alone, nobody else.
The same man who once outsmarted Gus Fring was suddenly confessing to crimes over an open line, handing the DEA exactly what they needed to prosecute him. It wasn't strategy. It was desperation dressed up as genius.
So hey, how's business? Car wash.
The irony, of course, is that Walt never needed that money. The car wash was more than enough to sustain his family, and Skylar had already pointed out that the endless laundering had become redundant. Yet Walt's sense of control, The illusion of power was too intoxicating to abandon.
This family is everything to me.
The man who started cooking for the family couldn't stop once his pride took the wheel.
I am turning down you!
And then there's Jesse. Walt dismissed every sign that his former partner might have turned on him. The silent phone calls, the fake GPS story, the suspiciously timed bait. It all screamed cooperation with law enforcement. But Walt didn't see it. Why? Because he couldn't imagine Jesse as anything more than an emotional liability, never as a potential adversary. By the time he realized the truth, he was already dialing Jack's crew to clean up the mess he'd created. It wasn't that Walt wanted to be caught, it's that he wanted to be known. The same ego that fueled his resentment toward Gretchen and Elliot, his desperate need for recognition, bled into every decision he made. Being the unseen genius of gray matter was his lifelong humiliation, and Heisenberg was his overcorrection.
The person who gave me this present.
He didn't crave anonymity. He craved credit. This need for validation metastasized long before the desert phone call. When he drunkenly taunted Hank at dinner, hinting that Gail might not be the real Heisenberg, he practically begged for discovery.
I think last night was a cry for help.
It wasn't the thrill of danger. It was the satisfaction of knowing he was smarter than the man across the table. And that moment, more than any meth deal or gunfight, sealed his fate.
I need you to believe this.
Every misstep that followed, killing Mike out of wounded pride, trusting Saul's cronies too blindly, assuming everyone else was dumber than him, stemmed from the same poisoned root. Walt's intelligence made him powerful. His ego made him predictable. He didn't die because he was greedy or reckless. He died because he couldn't stand the idea of someone else taking credit for his empire. In the end, Walter White wasn't undone by chemistry, money, or luck.
I alone should suffer the consequence.
He was undone by the one element he could never control: himself. Walt broke bad. You can just break the algorithm. Subscribe.